Welcome to the TrueWorks podcast, the podcast that attempts to help you understand the gospel, what it is, and how it applies to your work and life. I'm your host, Joshua Smith, and with me today is Doug Meikle. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Joshua. Glad to be here.
Yes, I like your shirt.
Yes, I've gone casual for this episode. I've gone a short sleeve shirt. So,
It's nice. I said it was nice.
Yeah, but I have gone casual. So, let's see how St. Augustine likes that.
Yeah. Is he a casual guy or a formal guy? We'll figure some of that out, or maybe not at all, as we look at one of his most famous works, the Confessions. This episode's going to be long.
It is.
Doug loves Augustine.
I do love Augustine, yeah.
I love Augustine as well. Interesting fact about Augustine.
Tell me.
In this particular work, the Confessions is probably the first autobiographical work in Western history.
It's believed so, yeah. The autobiography didn't really exist before this point. Certainly not in something you would recognize in a modern format, whereas the modern writer has a lot of accessibility to this, and it was written when, Joshua?
Oh, I don't.
396 AD.
396. I was going to guess,
so.
419
yeah,
or something.
So, Augustine kind of spans the year 400, I think. Yeah, he was born in the tail end of the 4th century and then lived on into the 5th century. Yeah. But this, I think, was written in 396 AD.
My theology 1 professor in seminary said if there was a list of the top 100 books in Western history, not theology, just top 100 books, Augustine would be the only one with 3 books on the list. Of course, this was his kind of...
And that was, I guess, the Confessions and City of God and the Trinity, maybe.
Yes, on the Trinity.
On the Trinity,
that's right.
yeah.
Yes. So those 3.
Yeah.
I haven't cracked open the other 2, although you've read...
I've read City of God.
City of God.
A couple of times.
So what we're going to talk about is try to open up, try to motivate you to read the Confessions. And even though this book is written so long ago, it's one of the oldest works other than the Bible that we're going to read, or I guess it is. It is the oldest work that we're going to read. He is just uncanny in his kind of relatability, in his readability, in how, in many ways, we read 1,000 years after him in Calvin and Luther, even from the 20th century. And I felt when I read it, they don't read nearly as well or relatable. It's almost like he's just writing a few years ago in the things that he's talking about.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that you read this book and you feel this is a person that knows me, knows my predicament, knows the world in which I live, and he's writing in the year 396 or 395 by candlelight in North Africa. So he's also an African as well, a North African, of course, and not a Central African, and that was a big part of the Roman Empire at that time. Of course, and a very productive part of the Roman Empire at that time. But he's just a guy that seems to really understand the longing of the human heart. And that part about our existence doesn't appear to have changed a whole lot in the last 1,500 years or so, because he's very insightful about our human predicament today.
Yeah, because he knows that, and because he knows the Creator who never changes. Yeah. Then we can read him these 1,500 years later. And also because of this kind of beginning of self-reflection, right? Like prior to this, you didn't include yourself in your writing, but you can read the Confessions as just a long prayer, as him reflecting on his own conversion, but also what he now believes. So Confessions kind of carries a double meaning here.
Yeah, and it's him In fact, he writes a later book, which is actually, I think, Retractions or something like that, where stuff that he believed earlier in his career as a theologian, he kind of says, no, this is what I've changed my mind about. But this is really, to some extent, about his personal life and his conversion and immediately after that. And you see in him just this kind of great humanity as well, right? A guy that you would recognize and want as your friend, you know, and even though there's a few parts of his early friendships that he clearly feels he let down the folks that were his friends.
But it's because of that honesty.
Yeah.
Right? Like he is not making any he's not hiding any of his flaws.
No.
My goodness, he doesn't hide his flaws.
Yeah.
He lets them out on full display.
Yeah.
And we who are actors, who are sometimes led to hide our flaws, he says, you know, Christ even redeems those things.
Yeah.
Lay it all out.
Yeah, that's also a very that's a theme within his work as well, is that Christ redeems all of us, including our flaws, and those flaws are, in fact, and our times when we don't live up to the calling we have as Christian people. God uses even those moments. Those moments are redeemed, and they become part of the total new person that is created. So I think that's another thing about Augustine's insight into the human condition, or the Christian vision of it, is that even our stumbling and our falling, ultimately the redemption of those things creates this fuller human being redeemed, you know. And I think that's a great insight for anybody who's made a mistake in life. The mistake is still a mistake, but God uses those mistakes to create a fuller you in the future. And I just think that's a wonderful gift to the church and gift to Christian people to think of it that way, you know. Anyway,
what we meant for evil, God
meant for good. Yeah.
That is the extent of his power,
Yeah.
that he can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Augustine famously starts this book with an insight into the nature of the human predicament, and basically begins the book with a statement that says that God created us for himself, and our hearts are restless until we find our rest in God. And that, it seems to me, is the kind of basic statement at the start of the work that is unpacked through several chapters.
Again
you know,
and
that's again and again he returns to that, is that our hearts long for God. And in fact, our heart longing is actually part of our human condition. That's one of the things we have to kind of fix, and he's got an interesting fix for that as well. But the longing of our heart to be in relationship with God is a fundamental characteristic of being human.
Yeah.
We don't walk away from that.
That otherwise we would no longer be human.
Yeah,
right?
we'd stop being we'd stop being human. And that's where, you know, I think, I mean, Christians say these kinds of things, of course, but when you look at many of the world's current problems, part of that interpretation that folks that longing still exists. That longing for meaning, that longing for purpose, that longing for relationship is built into the very fabric of our personhood. And his point is that, yes, that longing is there, it's real, and if you don't get that right relationship with your creator, it's always going to be there. That itch at the back of your mind is always going to be there.
And we will fill it.
Yeah, with
right?
something.
Yeah, so
we
another famous line is, seek what you seek, but not where you seek it.
Yeah.
Right? And this idea of, you are a seeker, you are a lover, and you will love something. You will give your utmost loyalty
to something.
And if that, because of your constitution, because of the way you're created, if that is not your creator, disruption, defection, sorrow will result from that.
Yeah, and I think that basic also understanding is that, and it's packed in that definition right there, that we are lovers, that we are, you know, who is it said, I think, therefore I am.
Yeah, Descartes.
Descartes, right? This, in contrast, is that I love, therefore I am. You know, that because I love things, I want to be in relationship with things. And one of the folks that have been through our Faith and Work Intensive a few years ago. I'd lunch with him just a month or so ago, and he felt that was the thing that really opened up to him the new possibilities in life, is because he did love his work. He did love sports. He did love his wife. He did love the thought of building something in the future. Those were all things that he really did love. And what he had never really understood is that those loves are just fine. It's great to have those loves. And what he says, you must have those loves. That's your orientation towards the world. You're going to love things and desire for things. But what you find in Augustine is this insight is you have to order those loves. When those loves are misordered, that's when the world starts to spiral out of control. And that oftentimes is what you see in our friends and our relatives, even other Christians, is that something that they can love, God would want them to love, is become the central focus and organizing principle of their lives, and it can't sustain the weight.
Yep, can't hold the water.
It can't hold the water.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there you go. That's maybe that's a bit of a long introduction to Saint Augustine's Confessions, but where do we go from here, host?
Well, I want to talk more about love because I love it.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about this kind of central driving factor of that, I love, therefore I am, and this is kind of the definition of human. We noted, or you noted, that people who are not Christians, they get that wrong, and that makes causes sorrow, causes problems. But Christians also get this wrong, right? Because look, I was just struck by what kind of picture of God is present for Augustine when he says, we are restless until we rest in you. It's not simply a dictator God.
No.
These are my decrees and measure up to them. And when we think of God as kind of this taskmaster, we think of, well, these are the things I kind of, I got to do to get to, because the boss is boss and I am not. But the other things that I really like, that's the things I want to get back to, but I can if I want to succeed.
Yeah.
But this story of your past, this past fellow, that these loves, God says, well, those are actually good if they're ordered well.
Right. Yeah.
That was likewise for me, just astounding. Like love music to the fullest extent, but not as your creator.
No.
You know.
No, and that's the thing. And that so what is it? How does that? So this is the Faith and Work Intensive. What does that insight give to us? Actually, there's a lot of folks who go through the Faith and Work Intensive that are very credentialed and very good at their work, whatever that work is. They're a great doctor, or a great lawyer, a great construction worker, great whatever. But there's a sense in which almost for many Christians that they're kind of guilty about that. They're kind of guilty about being good and enjoying it so much. What Augustine does is takes the potential.
Why would they feel guilty?
Well, because they've got it all framed the wrong way, right? That the 40 or 50 hours they put into a job every week is 40 or 50 hours where they're not doing God's work. I see. And God's work is for the professional people that we fund via our tithes or blah, blah, blah. You know, that framing of what does God want to do in the world is just wrong. And when their lives are opened up by someone like this, like the Book of Augustine, you start to, by Augustine's Confessions, they start to say, hey, wait a minute. This great skill that I have been given by God first, and secondly, I've honed through years of maybe practice and education, that can be redeemed and used by God in the furtherance of his mission here. And I think that really opens up a world of possibility that most folks just do not have. They don't have it. Work stops being something I do to get to the weekend. Work starts being this thing that has meaning in and of itself. And that is a revelation to many Christians. It's a revelation that is a revelation to many Christians, but that thought and the necessity of that thought is also a condemnation of how many Christians are taught in their home churches, that they don't, that they have this fundamental separation baked in their brain, that there are secular things and there are holy things. And I do secular stuff, and at the weekends I do a bit of holy.
Yeah.
For Augustine, that's just the complete wrong framing of the world.
Yeah.
That's just misunderstanding everything that you see around you.
Because he is led by the creation narrative.
Yeah.
He has a whole chapter.
Yeah, Psalm 24 as well. It's like the world, the earth is the Lord's and all that is within it. And someone like St. Augustine treats that like it's true. Like everything is God's. Everything. God put everything into the earth. Like he has a part in creation. Later in the book, he talks about time as well.
That's a trippy chapter.
That's a mind-bending thing. We don't ask our faith and work folks to go through that, but his basic point there, that time is also created by God, and that once you get your head around that, the only time is kind of given to us and created by God to give us, if you like, a sphere of reference, a points of reference, created for us. God doesn't need time. God is eternal. We need time.
Yeah, God is outside. Yeah,
outside of that.
My master's thesis was on God and time, and I really focused on that chapter and never understood it fully.
He's that kind of guy, and it's funny that there's the guy that you meet 1,500 years later who can completely get ahead of you. It's St. Augustine is an incredible person, and in the history of humanity, he's an incredible person. He's significant way beyond just the Christian world.
Absolutely. He stands at the Roman Empire is about to fall to the Visigoths, and he has this incredible responsibility, and he's trained, in classical rhetoric. And part of the reasons that he also writes the Confessions is he's trying to convince people that his conversion is legit and authentic. Because as you will see, as he goes through his young adult life, he lived on the wild side.
He lived life to its fullest.
Yes, he did. He was searching after it, and he follows this certain kind of school of thought that's something like a religion that was not Christianity, and he was not in any way shy about it. He was shouting it from the rooftop, so to speak. And so the Confessions is also a way for him to convince people that I have met the risen Lord, and he has changed me.
He has changed me.
He has pursued me.
I mean, St. Augustine's famous for another quote, and probably, maybe you guys have come across this, but and it's within the Confessions as well, is that, what is it he says? Lord, make me chaste, but not yet.
But not yet.
But not yet.
Yes.
So he
give
had
me
a pretty
constancy and give me chastity, but not yet.
Not yet.
Yes.
That's right. And so the story there is full. I mean, he... Again, in the modern world, we think our modern world is this hypersexualized place, and indeed it was. Indeed it is, but it's not like that. The Roman times were also a highly sexualized world, and also the role of the woman within that world was rather powerless sexually. So St. Augustine had a concubine. Which would have been not uncommon. Uncommon in that time before he became a Christian. He had a son by that concubine as well. And there's a little bit in the Confessions about how that relationship develops in
Ariodatus,
time. Ariodatus, And that whole kind of, and concubines in that time were often procured by fathers who sought to bring their children, kind of, especially sons, make them sexually proficient, and folks don't know that for sure, but that may be the origin of his acquiring a concubine. So it's a world that we assume that we live in, this hypersexualized world, but that's not we don't live in a unique time.
That's right. We do live in a hypersexualized world, but the church has seen this before.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. I mean, you can't read First and Second Corinthians.
Yeah.
Paul is dealing with this.
Yeah.
It's not a unique challenge to the church that, lo and behold, monogamous, lifelong relationships between a man and a woman is not popular to the world.
Yeah.
But the church has met this before. Yeah. And to me, Doug, and I think this is why you were mentioning it, that brings me great comfort, because I look at the culture sometimes and I think, where the hell do we start?
Yeah.
How are we going to make the gospel? But is this not what Augustine was laid at his door?
Yeah.
And we have to trust in the power of Christ. We have to be faithful, yes, all this stuff, but ultimately, it is in God knows his world that he introduced his son in the gospel.
Yeah, and we'll get to this as you guys go through the book. You'll see this. Well, there are several places where he talks about just being swept along by the tide of his friends, for example. But the thing about Augustine that's really good is that in many of these moments, as a mature man and Christian now, he reflects back in ways that are very instructive about, why did I do that stuff? Why did I do it? There's the very famous example of him and his friends stealing pears from a garden, and he uses that to reflect on, look, why did I do it? I don't even like pears. Why am I doing this? Right?
Yeah. And he mentions in that episode that they didn't even eat them.
They didn't eat
right?
them.
That they stole them and then they threw them to the pigs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense of him reflecting back on, why am I doing this stuff? And I think that's what makes it, I think, very insightful for just the human condition, is that he's a great observer of humanity and the stuff that goes on around him.
Yeah, and his own psyche.
And his own psyche as well. About why did he pursue a career? He was very aggressively career-orientated in his world.
Hugely ambitious.
And in a way that we will recognize today, is that there's a lot of folks now that are hugely ambitious. And he wanted to get to the center of the known world at that point, at that point, I guess the head of the empire was in Milan, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is it Milan?
Yeah,
I think so. But he eventually gets to Milan and becomes this kind of professional rhetoric teacher, and that's a way of gaining influence in the world. And it ultimately just comes apart for him, is that all of this seeking after influence didn't really satisfy that longing in his heart that he started his book with.
Yeah, he mentions something like, all I wanted to do is, teach and these kinds of students at this kind of place.
Yeah.
And they don't really want to pay.
Yeah.
They're not even that good of students. And this is simply a microcosm of every time we take a created thing and treat it like the creator.
Yeah.
We are longing for this union with our maker. And when we pursue career that we see still today, when we pursue human relationships that are so good, but they're not what will satisfy us.
And St. Augustine has also a great confidence in God's redemptive power to set things right. Mm-hmm. So you see, even in his, there's also another famous quote of his in one of his sermons, and that's another note just in passing as well. We have more writings from St. Augustine than any other ancient writer up to that point. In fact, sometimes orders of magnitude more, because folks would follow him around as he preached, as he did every week, at least twice a week, every week of his entire career as a Christian pastor, then bishop. Folks would write all that stuff down. So I think this was an Easter sermon sometime in the early 5th century. This quote is, love God and do what you want. Which seems to a lot of Christians, that seems kind of scary, right?
A little permissive there.
A little permissive there,
but
right?
let's unpack that just briefly.
But his point is just simply this. Again, it's about ordering one's loves. If the primary love is the love of God, then do what you like. And what you like will be something that honors God. Mm-hmm. That whole orientation of life will be completely different. You won't be worried about, is this outside the boundaries or not? Because those boundaries, one, are larger than you often think, but secondly, of all, your love of God orientates you towards the things that honor God. And I think he had this tremendous confidence that God is there for you and with you and is not going to let you go. You know, he's not going to let you go. It's a beautiful thing. We haven't mentioned his mother yet, who's also a prime character in the story of the Confessions.
Augustine wouldn't be who he was. We wouldn't be talking about him today.
Without Santa Monica. His mother's name was Monica. And she plays a real role of the mother who prays for her son.
For years.
For years.
Yeah. I mean, as he's going through these ambitions that were likely instilled, at least partly, by his father. Remember, his father who buys him the concubine, his father was not a believer.
No.
So the mother is praying kind of on her own. For years and years, he goes off to great academies and is climbing a ladder, and she is still faithfully praying.
Yeah.
And what an encouragement. I have young kids. You're an empty nester, grown kids, of God's faithfulness to those prayers.
Yeah.
That eventually, I mean, who would think when Augustine's 17 and he's getting, doing the pairs or doing whatever else that he shares with living life to the fullest, that he would become bishop in just, a decade's time.
Yeah.
It's a great encouragement.
It's a great encouragement.
Yeah.
Yeah, this entire story, I think, is just something that we hope that the folks on the Faith and Work Intensive will love. We hope also that it opens up a resource to them that has been a resource to the church for 1,500 plus years. St. Augustine is probably, I think the way that you put it, Joshua, it said after St. Paul and the Bible, St. Augustine is the great Christian saint who has most affected the church globally.
Yeah,
because he comes, of course, before the church split into East and West, and he is a saint of the church of both East and West. So he's seen as a real foundational guy, and for many of the things that we take for granted as Christian people were framed and understood by St. Augustine and passed down to us. You know,
and then, of course,
receive
before the Reformation for as
sure.
well.
We're going to go on to a couple of short works by Luther and Calvin before we, in the next couple of podcast series, and what you'll find there certainly, well, actually in both Luther and Calvin. If it's in Luther and Calvin, it probably means it was in Augustine before them.
First.
Because one of the great kind of instances of the Reformation was finding again the works of Augustine and others. And those works were the works that really were the foundations, along with the Bible, of course, for this Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. But you cannot overestimate the influence St. Augustine has had on our church and so much of the world. Much of the world.
Thank you so much for joining us for the TrueWorks podcast, where we looked at St. Augustine's Confessions. I hope it gives you some insight and framework and motivation to jump into the larger body of that work. If you're interested in other episodes, our podcast can be found on all platforms, or you can visit us on our website at trueworkshouston.org. Thank you again.